Welcome. The valleys of Jammu and Kashmir. They really paint this picture of incredible natural beauty, don't they? A landscape just steeped in history.
Absolutely stunning. But as you know, this very region has also been right at the heart of a really long-standing and often, let's face it, intense conflict.
Exactly. So today we're taking a focused look, a deep dive into this complex issue. We'll be examining the Kashmir conflict specifically through the lens of India's perspective.
And we're drawing on quite a collection of sources here, articles, research papers, to try and piece together that viewpoint.
Right, because it's a story that's just fundamentally tied to the very creation of both modern India and Pakistan. To really get a handle on India's position, you have to go back, way back, to those critical moments in their shared history.
Yeah, it's deeply layered, no doubt about it. And look, the sheer amount of information out there, it can feel pretty overwhelming sometimes.
It really can. So our mission today, our goal for this deep dive, is to kind of distill the most crucial insights. We want to give you, our listener, a clear, engaging understanding.
Understanding the origins, the key events, the current dynamics of the conflict, all as India sees them.
Okay, so let's begin. Where do we start? Kashmir, before the subcontinent was partitioned, right?
Yes. Before 1947, Jammu and Kashmir was one of around 570 princely states. They were under what was called British paramountcy.
Which essentially meant they had internal self-rule, but Britain handled things like foreign policy, defense.
Exactly. The state itself was ruled by a Hindu Maharaja, Hari Singh, from the Dogra dynasty. They've been ruling since 1846. There was a British resident, their representative, in Srinagar.
Okay.
But here's a really key point, the demographics. In 1941, the census showed the population was overwhelmingly Muslim, maybe around 77%.
77% Muslim, but ruled by a Hindu Maharaja.
Right. And that specific situation, that dynamic Muslim majority, a Hindu ruler, created these, well, inherent political complexities, complications that both India and Pakistan would, later try to use in their own narratives.
That demographic picture definitely adds another layer to the choices facing these princely states when the Indian Independence Act came in 1947.
It really does. They basically had three options. Join India, join Pakistan, or try to stay independent.
And Maharaja Hari Singh, initially, he leaned towards independence.
He did. He seemed to have genuine concerns about how minorities might be treated in either of the new countries. So to try and maintain things as they were, he sought what were called standstill agreements.
With both India and Pakistan.
Yes. The idea was to keep existing administrative and economic arrangements going. Pakistan actually accepted this agreement, even kept managing Kashmir's postal system for a time.
But India didn't sign right away.
India suggested, well, that more discussions were needed first, but things were moving so fast on the ground, those further talks, they never really happened.
And this is where the timeline gets really critical, especially from India's perspective.
Absolutely.
Because India's view is that Pakistan didn't wait for any further discussion. They see Pakistan as the aggressor here.
Initiating military action to seize territory.
And the timing, just weeks after both countries became independent, India points to that as evidence suggesting this wasn't spontaneous, but maybe pre-planned.
And it's interesting how the Maharaja himself described the forces involved. In his letters asking for help, he called them Afridis, soldiers in plain clothes and desperados with modern weapons.
Desperados with modern weapons.
Transported in motor trucks. I mean, that suggests organization, logistics, something beyond just local rebels, doesn't it?
It does, and he specifically named the Provisional Government of the Northwest Frontier Province as being involved.
So for India, this was a clear act of aggression and a violation of that standstill agreement Pakistan had accepted.
Right. So the capital, Srinagar, is under imminent threat. The Maharaja makes a desperate appeal to India for military help.
And India's response was clear-cut. Help would come, but on one condition: formal accession of Jammu and Kashmir to the Dominion of India.
So the signing of the Instrument of Accession.
October 26, 1947. Signed by Maharaja Hari Singh. It was, a standard legal document for the time, based on the Government of India Act of 1935, laying out how princely states could join.
And Lord Mountbatten, representing India, accepted it the next day, October 27th.
Correct. Now, it's worth noting briefly that while India firmly sees this accession as legally sound, completely valid, there have always been differing interpretations of its clauses and debates around its standing under international law over the years.
Sure, but from India's legal standpoint, this is the moment Jammu and Kashmir becomes part of India.
Legally, yes. And the instrument specified the areas transferred to India's control. Defense, foreign affairs, and communications. Crucial areas.
So that legality, that validity of the instrument of accession, that's really the bedrock of India's entire claim to sovereignty over Kashmir.
It is. They see it as a constitutional necessary step taken because of what they view as Pakistan's aggression. It's the absolute foundation of their position.
Okay, so we've got the legal basis laid out from India's viewpoint. But what happened immediately on the ground? Partition itself was incredibly violent.
Oh, catastrophic is probably the word.
Yeah.
Widespread communal violence, maybe 11 million people displaced, huge loss of life, perhaps up to 1 million.
Unbelievable scale.
And Jammu and Kashmir sharing that border with Punjab, it was hit hard. Refugees poured in, communal tensions just skyrocketed. And the Maharaja's initial hesitation about joining either India or Pakistan, well, it created a kind of power vacuum.
A vacuum that India believes Pakistan moved to exploit.
Through that invasion in October 1947, yes, what India calls the orchestrated tribal invasion.
Let's dig into that term tribal invasion a bit more, as India portrays it.
Right. India's perspective is that this wasn't just small local skirmishes. It was a large-scale organized invasion by these tribal Lashkar militias, primarily from Waziristan in the tribal areas of what's now Pakistan.
And they maintain there was official involvement.
They point to evidence suggesting officials from the Muslim League, the ruling party in Pakistan, specifically in the Northwest Frontier Province, were involved in organizing and facilitating this whole operation.
And again, the Maharaja's own words describing organized forces, modern weapons, trucks.
Exactly. It all points, in India's narrative, to external orchestration by Pakistan, a clear violation of the standstill agreement.
Yeah.
And the consequences for people in Kashmir were just devastating reports of widespread death, destruction, looting. Terrible.
So, faced with this, the Maharaja appeals to India, signs the instrument of accession. What was India's immediate military reaction?
Swift. Indian troops were airlifted directly into Srinagar on October 27, 1947.
The day after the accession was signed, the day it was accepted.
Precisely. And that really marks the start of the First Indo-Pakistani War, 1947-48, sometimes called the First Kashmir War.
And Indian troops fought alongside the existing Jammu and Kashmir state forces?
Yes, against the invaders and also what were described as irregular Pakistani forces.
And then the United Nations gets involved.
Yes. India took the issue to the UN, hoping for a peaceful resolution. The UN Security Council passed resolutions, famously recommending a plebiscite.
A vote for the Kashmiri people to decide their future.
That was the idea, but, and this is crucial, it was conditional. The main condition was the demilitarization of the region by both India and Pakistan.
And that never happened.
No, they could never agree on how to actually do the demilitarization. So the plebiscite recommended in those early resolutions never took place. It's worth noting the UN passed other resolutions too, but the plebiscite remains the most discussed point.
So no plebiscite. What was the result of that first war then?
It ended with a ceasefire on January 1st, 1949. And that ceasefire line over time solidified into what we now know as the line of control, the LASI.
The LASI that still divides Kashmir today.
Exactly. The outcome was a divided Kashmir. Pakistan ended up administering the territories they call Azad Kashmir and also Gilgit-Baltistan. India administered the rest, which eventually became the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir.
And from India's perspective, this division was a direct result of Pakistan's initial aggression.
That's their core argument, yes.
Okay, so that really sets the scene for the decades of conflict that followed. The tensions obviously didn't end there. Let's move on to the later wars, 1965 and 1971.
Right. The 1965 war, India views this as being started by Pakistan through a covert operation. It was codenamed Operation Gibraltar, launched in August 65.
And the goal?
The aim was to infiltrate Pakistani soldiers, disguised as local Kashmiris, across the Las. The hope was to spark a large-scale insurgency inside Jammu and Kashmir.
Pakistan thought the conditions were ripe for an uprising.
Apparently so. Perhaps they miscalculated, maybe based on India's performance in the 1962 war against China. They seemed to expect the local population to rise up.
But that didn't happen, according to India.
Largely no. India maintains the local Kashmiri population mostly didn't support the infiltrators. In fact, in many cases, locals actually provided intelligence to Indian security forces about them.
Which helps foil the plan.
Exactly. It led to many infiltrators being caught and the operation basically unraveling. For India, this really reinforced their narrative that the insurgency, at least back then, wasn't a genuine local movement.
How did India respond militarily?
With a pretty strong counteroffensive, they crossed the ceasefire line themselves and captured some strategically key areas, like the Haji Pir Pass.
So the war ended how?
It ended basically in a stalemate. There was a ceasefire, followed by the Tashkent Agreement, mediated by the Soviet Union. But India definitely considers Operation Gibraltar a major strategic and political failure for Pakistan.
Okay, then 1971. A war with much bigger consequences, obviously leading to the creation of Bangladesh.
Indeed. The main driver was absolutely the crisis in East Pakistan, the Bangladesh Liberation War, and the Pakistan Army's actions there. But Kashmir was still a factor on the Western Front.
How did it play out there?
India's direct involvement in the war came after Pakistan launched preemptive airstrikes on Indian airfields. The war itself was short, decisive. India won, leading to the surrender of Pakistani forces in Dhaka and Bangladesh's independence.
And on the Western Front, in and around Kashmir.
India captured quite a bit of territory there, around 15,000 square kilometers of Pakistani territory, actually, though most of it was returned later under the peace agreement.
And that agreement was the Simla Agreement, right, in 1972?
Yes, a really crucial agreement
Yeah.
signed in Simla. It aimed to normalize relations and set up a framework for resolving all disputes bilaterally.
Bilaterally, just between India and Pakistan.
Exactly. That's key. It formalized the line of control that resulted from the 1971 fighting. Both sides committed to respecting the law sea and not trying to change it unilaterally.
And crucially,
The agreement explicitly stated that all outstanding issues, including Kashmir, would be settled through bilateral negotiations. No third-party involvement, like the UN.
so India interprets that to mean,
That Kashmir became strictly a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan, full stop. And therefore, any attempt by Pakistan to bring in international mediators or raise it at the UN, India sees that as a violation of the Simla Agreement.
okay, so after these big conventional wars, the conflict shifts again, doesn't it? India describes the next phase as Pakistan's proxy war.
Yes, starting roughly in the late 1980s, India reports a significant escalation in armed insurgency within Kashmir.
Now, India does acknowledge some local political issues around that time, like the controversial 1987 elections.
They do acknowledge some level of political discontent, yes, but they strongly emphasize Pakistan's role in, let's say, weaponizing and directing that discontent, transforming it into a much more violent, widespread insurgency.
And a key element, India says, was the influx of foreign fighters.
Right, particularly Muslim jihadist militants, many of whom had fought against the Soviets in Afghanistan. India maintains these fighters infiltrated into Kashmir primarily through territory controlled by Pakistan.
And this is where the accusations against Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI, become really central.
Absolutely central. India has consistently, for decades now, accused the ISI, the Inter-Services Intelligence, of directly arming, training, and funding militant groups operating in Jammu and Kashmir.
Pakistan denies this, of course.
Consistently. Pakistan maintains its support is only moral, diplomatic, and political, not material.
But India points to the presence of these groups openly operating inside Pakistan.
Yes. The fact that numerous militant groups known to operate in Kashmir have had bases, training camps, and leadership openly present in Pakistan, well, it creates what many international observers, not just India, call a serious credibility problem for Pakistan's denials.
So the perception, certainly from India and some others, is that Pakistan uses these groups as proxies.
That's the allegation, that these non-state actors have been used, at least at times, as an instrument of state policy against India. International think tanks have commented on this credibility problem quite extensively.
Can you name some of the main groups India identifies in this proxy war?
Sure. The nature of the groups shifted over time. Early on, some groups, like the JKLF, Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front, focused more on independence. But later, groups emerged that India says were much more closely aligned with Pakistan, aiming for merger with Pakistan.
And allegedly receiving direct support.
India points to evidence of weapons, explosives, funding smuggled across the Law Sea. Key groups include Lashkar-e-Taiba, or LAT. India alleges strong ISI links and blames them for major attacks like the 2008 Mumbai siege.
And the recent Pahalgam attack was claimed by an offshoot TRF.
The Resistance Front, yes, believed to be an alleged offshoot. Then there's Jaish-e-Mohammed, JEM, again, alleged ISI ties. They claimed the 2019 Pulwama bombing, which killed over 40 Indian paramilitary personnel. Their stated goal is uniting Kashmir with Pakistan.
Others.
Hizbul Mujahideen is another major one, active for a long time, often targeted by Indian forces. And earlier groups too, like Allah Tigers, Hizb-e-Islami, and India maintains they all received Pakistani backing.
And the alleged objectives behind this support.
From India's perspective, trying to change the Lasi by force, trying to internationalize the Kashmir dispute despite Simla undermining Indian security forces' morale, weakening the Indian state's hold, and providing logistics for militants.
This period also saw a terrible tragedy, the exodus of the Kashmiri Pandits.
A truly tragic chapter. In the early 1990s, large numbers of Kashmir Pandits, the indigenous Hindu community of the valley, were forced to flee their homes.
How does India frame this?
India views it as a deliberate campaign of ethnic cleansing, driven by sectarian motives, carried out by militant groups backed by Pakistan. They also point to Article 35A.
The one restricting residency rights.
Yes. India argued it effectively stripped Pandits who left of their rights, making it very hard for them to ever return. They say abrogating 370 and 35A was partly about addressing that historical injustice.
And recent events, like the Pahalgam attack,
Are seen by India as a grim continuation. Reports suggested Hindu tourists were specifically singled out, asked religious questions before being shot. India frames this squarely as religiously motivated violence, ethnic targeting.
In response to all this, particularly the attacks, India's approach seems to have shifted in recent years, more forceful retaliation.
Definitely a perceived shift towards a more muscular policy. The surgical strikes in 2016 were a major signal.
This was after the Uri army base attack?
Yes, September 2016, 19 soldiers killed. India blamed GEM. Days later, Indian special forces crossed the Lac Sea.
What did they target?
India said they hit militant launch pads just a few kilometers inside Pakistan-administered Kashmir. They claimed significant militant casualties, maybe 35-40.
And the significant.
That was the first time India publicly acknowledged conducting such cross-Law Sea operations. A clear message, a new, firmer approach.
Then came the Balakot airstrike in 2019.
After the Pulwama bombing in February 2019, claimed by GEM, this time the Indian Air Force went much deeper.
Where did they strike?
They bombed what India identified as a major GEM training camp in Balakot, which is well inside Pakistan proper, in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province.
That was unprecedented since 1971, wasn't it? Striking undisputed Pakistani territory.
It was. India called it a non-military preemptive strike. They said they targeted a large number of terrorists preparing more attacks. The message was even stronger. We will hit the source, wherever it is.
And most recently, Operation Sindoor in 2025.
Following the Pahalgam attack in April 2025, claimed by TRF, the Lafite offshoot, India reportedly launched a large-scale operation codenamed Sindoor.
What did that involve?
Reports indicate precision missile and airstrikes on multiple sites 9, according to some reports in Pakistan and Pakistan-administered Kashmir, sites India identified as terrorist infrastructure.
Including alleged headquarters.
Yes, alleged HQs of GEM and Leti were mentioned as targets. India stressed they avoided Pakistani military or civilian facilities, calling the strikes focused, measured, and non-escalatory.
What weaponry was reportedly used?
Advanced platforms, Rafale jets with Scalp cruise missiles, Hammer precision bombs, BrahMos supersonic missiles, Sky Striker loitering munitions, sophisticated stuff.
And the claimed results?
India claimed around 100 terrorists killed and significant infrastructure dismantled. Pakistan confirmed strikes hit 6 sites, but denied they were terror facilities, alleged civilian casualties, and said damage was minimal.
A significant escalation, though.
Hugely significant. Some analysts called it a new benchmark. India's leadership indicated a willingness to strike even under perceived nuclear blackmail. It signals a shift from reactive containment towards proactive punishment.
Beyond these high-profile strikes, India has a broader strategy, right? Multi-pronged.
Absolutely. Militarily and through law enforcement, you have bodies like the Special Operations Group, SOG of the J&K Police, very active in counterinsurgency, often working with the Army and paramilitary forces.
And the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, AFSPA?
That's been enforced since 1990, granting special powers to the military. Plus, federal counterterror agencies are involved. Intelligence is obviously key, too.
How so?
India emphasizes meticulous planning, intelligence-led operations. They reportedly use assets like ISRO satellites, maybe 10 or more, for surveillance, real-time threat assessment.
Diplomatically.
A major push to, as they put it, expose Pakistan's nefarious designs globally. Sending delegations, briefing world leaders, and a huge focus on the FATF.
The Financial Action Task Force.
Yes, the global money laundering and terror financing watchdog. India has been presenting detailed dossiers arguing Pakistan isn't doing enough, that its removal from the Grey List was premature, and that it might even be misusing international funds. They want Pakistan put back on the list.
Seeking support from other countries.
Yes, lobbying key FATF members like the US, UK, Japan. raising concerns at the UN, too. We saw Slovenia, for instance, offering support recently.
And economically.
Measures like suspending parts of the Indus Waters Treaty, downgrading diplomatic ties, closing border crossings sometimes. These are described as retaliatory measures to pressure Pakistan, raise the cost of supporting terrorism, and erode its standing.
And throughout this, you have Pakistan's denials versus India's evidence.
It's a recurring pattern. After strikes, Pakistan denies terror camps were hit. India insists they have credible intelligence and acted responsibly. It comes back to that credibility problem international observers mention regarding Pakistan and terrorism. India uses the dossiers to FATF to bolster its claims.
Okay, let's shift to a major internal political move. The abrogation of Articles 370 and 35A in 2019. How does India connect this to the conflict?
India frames the abrogation as a crucial step for national integration, development, and importantly, for curbing terrorism. Article 370 gave Jammu and Kashmir's special autonomous status its own constitution, limited application of Indian laws.
And 35A restricted rights for non-residents.
Yes, things like owning property, getting government jobs, scholarships. India argued these articles were being misused, fostering corruption, misgovernance, and a sense of separatism that Pakistan exploited to fuel the conflict.
So the goal was full integration.
Full integration, applying all Indian laws equally, promoting national unity, boosting development, and removing what they thought as constitutional barriers that facilitated terrorism and unrest.
What was the legal basis India used for this?
It was done through presidential orders. One order modified how other parts of the Constitution applied to J&K, effectively allowing another order to declare Article 370 inoperative.
And this was challenged legally.
Yes, it went all the way to the Indian Supreme Court. In December 2023, the court unanimously upheld the abrogation.
What was the court's reasoning?
They affirmed the government's view that Article 370 was always intended as a temporary provision linked to the specific circumstances of 1947, the war, the accession. They also ruled that just because J&K's own constituent assembly dissolved back in the 1950s didn't make Article 370 permanent. The president's power to abrogate it remained valid.
So legally validated within India's constitutional framework.
Correct. That Supreme Court judgment is key to India's justification.
What specific benefits does India claim have resulted from this integration?
They list quite a few. Equal application of laws means, for example, better protections for women against domestic violence, abolition of triple talaq, equal property rights.
Rights for minorities, too.
Yes. Access to affirmative action for scheduled castes, which wasn't fully available before. Removal of property restrictions is meant to encourage investment and economic growth.
Better governance.
Application of national anti-corruption laws, setting up elected local bodies, panchayats. Also, national child rights laws now apply fully right to education, ban on child marriage.
And the state itself was reorganized.
Into 2 union territories, Jammu and Kashmir, which will have its own legislature eventually, and Ladakh, which is administered directly by the central government. India argues this allows for more focused administration and development.
But this move wasn't universally welcomed, was it? There were challenges.
Definitely not. There was opposition within Kashmir, significant international criticism too, particularly around human rights concerns, the initial security lockdown, communication blackouts.
How does India respond to that criticism?
India acknowledges the initial difficulties, but points to what it sees as significant progress since then. They highlight a decline in street violence, a big increase in tourism as signs of returning normalcy.
And the local population's view.
India emphasizes the resilience of Kashmiris, a growing desire for peace. They point to reports of educated youth condemning terror, even protesting against Pakistan. Officials quote border residents showing unity and patriotism.
The local politicians.
The local legislative assembly has condemned terror attacks, reaffirmed commitment to Kashmiriyat, Kashmiri identity, and unity. India tends to attribute any ongoing unrest primarily to Pakistan's intensified proxy war and external interference.
Okay, finally, let's circle back to India's international efforts regarding Kashmir.
As we touched on, it's a concerted diplomatic offensive. The goal is to isolate Pakistan internationally by highlighting its alleged role in sponsoring terrorism.
Those multi-party delegations.
Sent to capitals worldwide carrying the message of zero tolerance against terrorism. And the FATF focus is relentless.
The dossier is arguing Pakistan hasn't done enough on terror financing.
Exactly. Pushing hard for FATF to relist Pakistan, arguing the removal was premature, possibly influenced by geopolitics rather than facts on the ground, and that Pakistan might be misusing funds.
Raising it at the UN, too.
Yes, consistently raising allegations at the UN and other global forums. trying to build the broadest possible international consensus against state-sponsored terrorism.
So the goal is international pressure.
Yes, seeking unanimous support from key FATF members, bilateral discussions using global platforms. The parliamentary delegations, brief leaders, seek support for bringing terrorists and their backers to justice. The mantra is often, terror and talks cannot go hand in hand.
And citing support where they get it, like from Slovenia.
Right, and pointing to UN condemnations of specific attacks like Pahalgam, which call for accountability for perpetrators, organizers, financiers, and sponsors.
What's the intended impact on Pakistan?
To damage its global standing, make it harder to access international aid and investment. Remember the difficulties Pakistan faced when it was on the Grey List. By pushing for relisting, India aims to reimpose those costs.
Reinforcing that credibility issue we discussed.
Exactly. Highlighting the speculation about Pakistan using terror groups as policy. Combined with the economic measures, Indus Waters treaty adjustments, trade suspensions, downgrading ties, it's all designed to increase the cost for Pakistan and erode its regional and global influence.
Okay. So wrapping this deep dive up, if we summarize India's perspective based on our sources, it really starts with Pakistan's initial aggression back in '47.
Followed by decades of what India consistently portrays as a proxy war, fueled by state-sponsored terrorism crossing the border.
And India views its own actions, the military responses like surgical strikes, Balakot, Operation Sindoor, the internal political move of abrogating Article 370 as necessary defensive measures.
Necessary for defense, yes, but also for national integration, security, and the long-term stability and development of Jammu and Kashmir.
Coupled with that ongoing, intensive diplomatic effort to hold Pakistan accountable on the world stage.
Underpinning all this is India's unwavering assertion that Jammu and Kashmir is an integral part of India. There's a commitment to its peace and security, and an emphasis now on the resilience of the Kashmiri people themselves.
Highlighting a growing desire for peace among locals, a rejection of external interference, and an embrace of a future within India.
That's the narrative. A vision for a peaceful, prosperous, fully integrated Kashmir, free from terrorism and conflict.
It's certainly a complex and deeply contested history we've explored through India's lens today.
Absolutely. The competing narratives, the long history of conflict, the diplomatic maneuvering, it all shapes the current reality.
Which brings us to a final thought for you, our listener. Considering this deep dive into India's perspective, how might we understand the challenge for regional stability when accusations of state support for non-state actors persist over decades alongside consistent denials? What are the pathways forward in such a deeply polarized environment? Something to reflect on.